Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Dead of Winter by Brian Moreland. This book came out in 2011, and it was the second book to be written by Brian Moreland. And I actually had occasion to read his first book, which was Shadows in the Mist, which in turn came out in 2007. If you like World War II horror stories, definitely give that one a look. But Dead of Winter is a horror novel I very much enjoyed reading, and much like the book that came before it, there's a grounded in reality setting and a diverse cast of characters and a well-written cast as well. And you also have a supernatural form of horror that is looked at from a, shall we say, cultural perspective, and as a result, it's a form of horror that feels very unique. And so you have the horror of human evil, but in as well as straight up harsh frontier life, but you also have the horror of um, the horror that comes from, say, Native American folklore. And the amount of research that Brian Moreland did, both for, say, the grounded in reality historical based setting, as well as, say, the culture of the time, as well as the Native American folklore. I mean, it really comes across as the amount of research that Brian Moreland put into the story, basically, gives us a book wherein, we're invested because we're in an environment that's very much real, and we're also with a group of characters that we become invested in, as far as, say, we actually care about what happens to them. And when it comes to the horror, of course, we're on the edge of our seats. But it's also something that, at least in my opinion, is a fresh take on things in terms of, say, the types of horror and the types of monsters that are on hand in this particular story. So it takes place in 1870, and for the most part, takes place in Ontario, Canada. And the focus of the story is a gentleman by the name of Tom Hatcher, who's an inspector who came from the city of Montreal with his son to work out in a place called Fort Pendleton, which in turn is run by a gentleman named Avery Pendleton, who's kind of a fur trader tycoon. But he asked that Inspector Tom Hatcher come to Fort Pendleton to help with investigate a series of disappearances and murders. And the reason he asked for Tom specifically was because Tom Hatcher had actually captured a serial killer called the Cannery Cannibal. And this was a very notorious, serial killer. He was someone who was a member of high society, but who nonetheless, killed somewhere, around 30 women in horrifically brutal ways. And of course, him being a cannibal, I mean, that was definitely something that, terrified the public. But Tom Hatcher was the one who caught him. But seeing as how Tom Hatcher had dealt with the type of individual who would resort to cannibalism, Avery Pendleton is wanting Tom Hatcher's help, because some of the bodies of the people who had gone missing, had been found, but it looked like they've been, devoured, and not necessarily by animals, and so, basically, Tom and his son, come over to, this fort, to, live there for a while amongst, the locals, but also, so that Tom can, have a better chance of working with the authorities there, to possibly, track down either, this, group of cannibals that they believe is in the area, or a cannibal, which is making, the Ontario wilderness, their hunting ground. And so it turns out, though, that this rash of, death and cannibalism is, tied to something from a Native American folklore, a demonic entity called the Wendigo. And it turns out that there was another fort called Fort Manitou, which is in the area, that was built, on the hunting ground of the Wendigo. And the local Native American tribe, the Ojibwa, had, warned, the settlers, not to, not to hunt there, not to, build their homes there. But unfortunately, though, the people who, built built their homes, over on Fort at Manitou, on the land of the Wendigos, they didn't listen. And so, basically, they ended up giving into, cannibalism, as brought on by, the Wendigo. And so there was one survivor that manages to make her way to Fort Pendleton, and is found by Tom Hatcher and a search party, because they're in the process of trying to find another missing person. And they do find this missing person, but said missing person is, horrifically, murdered. And they're thinking that there's this, grizzly bear in the area that is kind of a, legend amongst some of the locals, because, this grizzly bear is supposedly like 10 feet tall or something like that. But, one of the people in the group is a Native American tracker named Anika, who is actually, convinced that this is not a grizzly bear. This is, the Wendigo, and because everyone else in the group is, convinced that it's a giant grizzly bear, but she's like, no, it's not. I mean, trust me. My people have, dealt with this, before, and so, but when they come across, this one survivor from Fort Manitou, it's a little girl. And they bring her, to Fort Pendleton. And unfortunately, this kind of starts an outbreak, because once she sort of comes to, she goes in and out of consciousness, but she ends up, biting a couple of the people. And this in turn, starts, an outbreak. And, anyone who's been bitten by her ends up, becoming, a Wendigo. And as a result, the people at Fort Pendleton, are, trying to figure out, okay, what's really going on here? I mean, is this something supernatural, or is this something, sort of psychosis, that's been brought on by disease or something? And of course, Tom Hatcher, though, is more than a little terrified by the situation, because, while he has basically, looked into the face of pure evil, when he apprehended the Cannery Cannibal, I mean, some of the stuff he sees, with this outbreak, beggars belief. And we're talking, say, like, physical transformation, in front of his eyes and what have you. People being able to take a ridiculous amount of, damage before going down, and an appetite that just doesn't end. And so, he finds himself, sort of caught between, multiple, parties, in the sense that on one hand, he's trying to do his job as an inspector and, do the job that Avery Pendleton, asked him to come out and do. But on the other hand, though, he finds himself, falling for Anika, because, the two of them, they bond through certain tragic experiences. And it turns out that, she's able to sort of help him, move past certain uh, forms of grief that he experiences, but she also gives him some insight into, say, what the Wendigo is and what her tribe knows about the Wendigo. Um, but unfortunately, though, um, this outbreak is something that it it sort of ebbs and flows, because one minute it seems like they may have the outbreak contained, but then next thing you know, there's someone else who's been infected, and also um, there's like this series of marks that are found on at some of the crime scenes, like some of the spots where people have been killed in these Wendigo attacks. There's like this circular pattern, and the scary thing is, along with, say, these grisly attacks and these physical transformations that Tom's seeing, he's seen this symbol before. When he tracked down the Cannery Cannibal, and so sure enough, there actually is a connection. And then we go to the character of Father Xavier, who is an exorcist from Montreal, who had actually attempted to perform an exorcism on the Cannery Cannibal in an insane asylum. But the Cannery Cannibal actually faked his death. And once everyone was convinced that he was dead, including Father Xavier, the guy basically came back to life and escaped after slaughtering several guards. And basically, Father Xavier comes to learn that this killer is tied to some real demonic evil, because the type of evil that he's connected to is something that Father Xavier had fought with in the past and was rather scarred by, in the sense of, say, losing a family member to this evil. And so when he talks to some fellow members of his religious order, he's tasked with going to Fort Pendleton, because they get word that the outbreak that started at Fort Manitou was something that was called the Devil's Plague. And his order of exorcists has actually done extensive research on it, and it's something that's come up more than once. But they basically try to keep the public from finding out about it, because it's something that on one hand they don't want to start a public panic, but on the other hand, though, they want to make sure that the right people have the right information. In this case, because they're the ones who are actually doing research on it, they decide to send Father Xavier to Fort Pendleton to do what he can, or one, to do the research and find out, okay, are these cannibalistic outbreaks in fact connected to this devil's plague that they've done research on. And so Father Xavier, as well as another priest who's an aspiring exorcist as well, or he's aspiring to be an exorcist and is being trained under Father Xavier, he had actually come from Fort Pendleton to enlist Father Xavier's aid, because they found a book on the lone survivor from Fort Manitou, the girl who basically started the outbreak. And there was lettering that was written in code, and it was addressed for the eyes of Father Xavier, but only Father Xavier would be able to read the message. And so once once this priest, from Fort Pendleton, is able to make contact with Father Xavier, the two of them basically, join together to go back to Fort Pendleton and, get to the bottom of this. And so when Father Xavier and Tom Hatcher's stories kind of, cross paths and join together, that's when, the horror, really comes into full swing, because, you have something that on one hand is, definitely, straight out of Native American folklore, and it's something that the local Indian tribes have, dealt with for, hundreds of years. But on the other hand, though, you have this devil's plague that, this, religious order of exorcists has done extensive, research on throughout the years. And there's more than a bit of correlation. But on the other hand, though, there's, the dark scheme of the resurrected serial killer, the Cannery Cannibal, and he very much, has a vendetta against Tom Hatcher. And so, Tom and Father Xavier, both find themselves, marked, by evil in more ways than one. And as well as, the inhabitants of, Fort Pendleton. But this was a really well-written horror story, and I think that it was a nice touch to have, the Wendigo, being looked at from, different perspectives, in a sense of, say, the Native American perspective, and then, of course, the perspective of, say, the church. And then you also have other people who are brought in to, say, try and find a scientific explanation for it all. But it was fascinating, seeing it from, different angles. But at the end of the day, though, the Wendigo is something that, at least within the story, it has been around for, thousands of years, and will probably still be here, after humanity's long gone. But, the Native American tribes that live in the area, they've had to contend with the Wendigo for a long time, and so they know how to, say, hide from the Wendigo. Like whenever, certain seasons come, then certain parts of the Ontario wilderness, are the hunting grounds of the Wendigo. And so when that happens, they know to leave the area for a time. But of course, with the colonists, they, either don't have, access to that information, or they just, dismiss, any warnings that, the Native American tribes, give them, because they're quote unquote just savages, right? But unfortunately, the colonists find out the hard way that, yeah, the Wendigo is a very, very real threat. And the way that the Wendigo was depicted, I thought was, rather fascinating, because, I mean, kind of, in some ways, it made me think of the movie Ravenous, in a sense that, anyone who's been infected by the bite of the Wendigo is basically afflicted with an unending hunger. Like they could eat anything and everything they have, say in the kitchen, but they're still hungry. And then basically they're hungry for, flesh and blood, like, warm blood, right? And so then they start, resorting to cannibalism. But the minute they resort to eating someone, that's when, they're officially transformed into the Wendigo. And because, you do that, and that gives the Wendigo entity a foothold on you. And so that's when, physical transformation comes into play. And it's a gradual process for the most part, because it's like the Wendigo will attack people on a spiritual level and get them when they're most vulnerable. And so if if someone's being, attacked by a Wendigo, mentally speaking, and they give in to, say, the dark impulses that are being, brought up, by the Wendigo, then that in turn, leads to the Wendigo having a foothold on this person. And then, of course, the Wendigo entity will, use its magic, if you will, to basically, cut people off from, say, outside help, and, to a point where, say, they'll start, having a craving, that just won't be satisfied. And so it's like cut them off, from, any hope, whatsoever, and so as a result, they're that much more vulnerable. And so when they're, afflicted with this hunger, and then they give into it, that's when, you have, another, Wendigo, if you will. And so when the physical transformations are described, that's when, and we're talking, you get into body horror territory. Like, we're talking elongated limbs, elongated, jaws and what have you, and, emaciated, bodies that are somehow still alive, or at least still moving with some twisted form of life. But so yeah, like the depiction of, the Wendigo in this particular story was more than a little scary. And also I liked how, say, whenever the Native American aspect was brought into it, as far as, say, the character of Anika, telling Tom what she knows and what her tribe knows about the Wendigo, it doesn't come across as, say, quote unquote magical Native American, moment. It comes across as, say, hey, myself and my people have dealt with this for a long time. It's a very real thing. Let me try and help you. That kind of thing. It doesn't come across as, oh, by the way, there's this, Native American, character just conveniently happens to have this, magical information that's a cure-all for it. I mean, it's nothing like that. And also, though, I liked how, the character of Tom is kind of a morally gray character. Like, he's a good, he's on the side of good, but there's a darkness to his character stemming from, something that happened in his youth, and, other life experiences they had, especially a recent family tragedy. And it was something that drove him and his son, from Montreal to the Ontario wilderness, but, we see him wrestle with this darkness, as well as, this, racism that he has, towards Indians. And there's a reason that he has this racism. And when we find out what it is, I mean, there's definitely an element of tragedy to it. But at the same time, we also see how, he gradually starts to, I guess, come around, as it were. Like, he starts to, basically, embrace, the aspect of, Native American, the Native American, way of life in some ways, but it's like he gets to know Anika as a person, and basically see her as a person, and not just, an Indian savage, like so many people of his ilk, are wont to do, unfortunately. But no, I mean, it's like we definitely see him, grow as a character. And so, when he's going up against, the forces of darkness, he uses what he, knows, from his experiences with the Cannery Cannibal. But also, I mean, when certain parts of the story come into play, he's able to basically have a bit of an edge when it comes to, say, going up against the Wendigo. But as far as the character of Father Xavier, he was a rather, fascinating individual as well, because he was someone who, much like Tom Hatcher, uh, Father Xavier is someone who is marked by family tragedy as well, and it's something that's basically shaped, the direction of his life, and to a point where he made a vow to, combat the devil, um, for as long as he lived. And so when he became an exorcist, I mean, he basically became like an expert level exorcist over time, to a point where he's valued as an exorcist by the Vatican of all places. And so, but he's also a character who is actually rather likable, in the sense that he actually has a down to earth sense of humor. And so he's not someone that comes across as a stuffy, um, I guess you could say, holy roller. I mean, he comes across as, hey, this is a likable fellow, someone on the side of good who actually is a good person, um, and so even though his character like has to contend with a lot of morally gray characters in the story, he himself is actually a morally good character that we find ourselves latching onto. Um, and also liked the character of Anika, because of course, we see, from her perspective, we see, the Native American perspective in terms of, say, how her and her people had their way of life, basically interrupted and damaged by the coming of the colonists. And also, I mean, they're already having to contend with, the threat of the Wendigo. And so when human evil, reared its head, I mean, you basically saw how, her people were kind of, screwed over in a lot of ways. And both on a supernatural level, as well as on, say, a basic human level as well. Um, but I liked how, regardless of how much abuse she has to put up with, I mean, there's a part of her, character that has this warmth that, is only on hand for a select few, characters to see, including Tom. But it's something that, when certain characters get to know her, it feels very rewarding. But and at the same time, gets us, further invested in her character, because she goes through a lot of really bad things, because amongst other things, she's actually the mistress of the head of the fort, Avery Pendleton, who's a very sordid individual. I mean, he projects this air of civilized tycoon, but he's actually mixed up in all sorts of nasty stuff. Both in terms of, say, what he does for his businesses, as well as, say, the fact that he's cheating on his wife with Anika, but he also is a part of, like, this fraternity that dabbles in very dark stuff. And so Avery Pendleton is a very sordid individual, and so whenever Anika is at his mercy, we're hoping that she's able to come out of this alive. But even Avery Pendleton, though, I mean, as bad of a individual as he does come across as a fleshed out individual. And there's even a moment or two when we learn some stuff about him from when he was younger, to where it's like we can kind of feel sorry for who he used to be, but we do not feel any pity for the person he is now. But a lot of the characters that we come across, I mean, those are the ones that get a lot of focus, right? But there are other characters that we get some introductions to them, and we get to know enough about them to where when things start to go wrong, we're kind of on the edge of our seats, because we feel like these are real characters being attacked by dark forces. And a lot of the horror in the story, I think, stands out in the sense that I mean, there's a lot of familiar types of horror that's on hand here. Like, there's some very spooky instances involving dolls. Because there's this one character, Willow, who's the wife of Avery Pendleton. Um, she has this doll collection, and it comes across as very childish initially, but then we find out some stuff about her and we understand why she has these dolls, right? But when the Wendigo starts to come into play, let's just say that there are several scenes where dolls are on hand and they're terrifying. And also, of course, you have some very terrifying nightmares that a lot of the characters have. And so, I mean, the horror on hand is very well depicted. um, and also, I just think that the idea of, say, the Wendigo being connected to a very human evil, as in, say, the Cannery Cannibal, who is in fact working with the Wendigo in a roundabout way. It's something where you realize that, I mean, evil knows evil. And the scenes where we see how the Cannery Cannibal's been supernaturally transformed by this entity that's worshiping, this evil entity that's worshiping. I mean, it's pretty terrifying, because you have some instances of body horror, wherein this guy will basically become like a walking horde of rats at one point. I mean, some pretty scary stuff, but he also appears in and out of people's nightmares. And so when certain characters realize that they've actually met this guy at one point in real life, and then they see him in their dreams, I mean, it's pretty scary. But yeah, very sordid antagonist. And we definitely fear for the well-being of Tom and those close to him, or because of the vendetta that this cannibal has against Tom, as well as other characters as well. But I will say that if there's one problem I have with the story, it's that when it comes to the third act, and we get a lot of pieces drop, a lot of pieces fall into place. It's not that the revelations don't make sense, but I do feel like in some ways they tied too well together. Like certain deals that certain characters made in the past, and somehow being connected to, say, dark fraternities and what have you, and then it turns out it's connected to Wendigo all along, or something like that. And then, of course, the Cannery Cannibal, himself, being a part of it all. It, in some way, it felt like everything just kind of fell into place. Maybe, I'm not going to say too pat, because that makes it sound like everything's a-okay, or everything turns out a-okay, because I assure you it doesn't. But just in terms of, say, how the revelations at the end are handled, I feel like Brian Moreland may have wanted to make it clear what was going on, as far as, say, why these things were happening. And so I think that if he had stuck with, say, basically, the Cannery Cannibal being in cahoots with the Wendigo, I think that, if he had, just kind of stuck with that part of the story in terms of, say, the revelations that come into play, and, how the two of them are connected. Because, of course, with Wendigo, I mean, you have, multiple forms of the Wendigo. It's not just like one single, individual. It's like there's, several of them. but at the same time, there's, one, I guess you could say, dark being, that leads the Wendigo. And so when we find out the Cannery Cannibals, connection to it all, see, that part I actually thought was well done, because it was establishing that, one, this wasn't all one and the same. Like, this was two different forms of evil. But when it came to, say, other revelations that came out, such as, say, certain, characters being involved in dark fraternities that somehow tied into all this, that's where I felt like Brian Moreland overextended his reach, and not to the point where, say, the story was ruined or anything like that, or I felt taken out of the story, because in its own way, some of these revelations were pretty terrifying as well, because, I mean, you look into stuff going on today, and, you find out how a lot of rich people are involved in, dark fraternities and, sordid practices as well. And so that actually, it did feel, realistic in a lot of ways, but the way it was tied into, say, the Cannery Cannibal and the Wendigo, that part felt like, okay, now Brian Moreland's just kind of overextending his reach, when he just probably should have stuck with, the Wendigo and the Cannery Cannibal and, the demonic power that they had. But all in all, though, I think that this was, a really good story. I think that Brian Moreland, definitely it showed signs of learning as a writer, because he was able to take certain similarities to, say, Shadows in the Mist, and bring them to a different setting, but nonetheless make a very different story. And so there's, you read both books, you can definitely tell they're written by him, as far as, say, the historical, horror that's on hand. But they're two very different settings, and they're two very different stories. But all in all, though, I think that I'm going to go ahead and give Dead of Winter 5 out of 5 stars. This was, a book that, had a good amount of horror and a really good amount of character development. And I also liked seeing how the Wendigo was depicted, because, whether you're seeing it from, say, a Native American standpoint, or from the standpoint of, say, someone from the church, or just, say, someone caught in the middle, like just, poor innocent civilian, being witness to all this, I mean, it's pretty terrifying. And I also liked how no one was safe in the story. I mean, like, you're thinking, it's like, if there's a little kid involved, the little kid's okay. No one's safe. So that was something else that I think added to the horror. But yeah, so Dead of Winter, I think I'll go ahead and give 5 out of 5 stars too. Aside from Brian Moreland, overreaching himself ever so slightly in the third act, I think that he crafted a wonderful story with some compelling characters in a very believable setting and environment, and the horror that was on hand was very memorably depicted as well. So 5 out of 5 stars. So that was Dead of Winter, and if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe, and thank you very much for taking the time to check me out on here. So y'all take care, have a good night, bye.